Nobody expected Frank Costello to walk into the Torrino family warehouse alone, unarmed, and carrying a briefcase full of cash. November 8, 1952, Red Hook, Brooklyn. The Torrino brothers had just declared war on Frank's empire by kidnapping Jacob Rosen, Frank's personal accountant who knew the location of every hidden asset, every secret account, and every illegal operation worth $50 million. The ransom demand was simple: give us half of Manhattan or watch Jacob die slowly. But what the Torrino brothers didn't know was that Frank had been expecting this move for 3 months, and the briefcase he carried contained something far more dangerous than money. The Torrino family had been circling Frank's territory like vultures for 2 years. Salvatore Antonio and Giuseppe Torrino controlled the docks from Red Hook to Bay Ridge, but they wanted more. They wanted the gambling operations in Midtown, the numbers racket in the village, and the labor unions that Frank controlled through careful corruption and strategic violence. The Torrinos were old-school Sicilians who believed territory belonged to whoever was strong enough to take it and hold it. Frank's accountant, Jacob Rosen, was more than just a bookkeeper. He was Frank's financial architect, the man who'd transformed a collection of street-level criminal operations into a sophisticated business empire. Jacob knew which judges were paid, which politicians were owned, which police captains looked the other way, and most importantly, where Frank kept the cash reserves that funded the entire organization. On November 5th, Jacob had been leaving his office on Lexington Avenue when 4 men grabbed him off the street and threw him into a black packet. The kidnapping was professional, efficient, and carefully planned. By the time Frank learned what had happened, Jacob was already hidden somewhere in the Torrino family's Brooklyn stronghold. The ransom call came at midnight. Salvatore Torrino's voice was confident, almost cheerful. "Frank, we got your Jew accountant, nice fellow, smart with numbers. Be ashamed if something happened to those clever fingers of his." Frank listened without interruption, his face expressionless. "What do you want, Sal?" "We want respect, Frank. We want recognition. We want half of Manhattan south of 42nd Street. The gambling, the loans, the unions, all of it. And if I say no, then Jacob Rosen starts losing pieces. Fingers first, then hands, then we get creative." Sal's voice turned ugly. "We know what he's worth to you, Frank. We know he's got your secrets locked up in that smart head of his." Frank was quiet for 30 seconds, considering his options. "I need time to think. You got 48 hours. Warehouse 47, Red Hook. Come alone with your answer." The line went dead. Frank set down the phone and smiled. Not a happy smile. The kind of smile that made smart men nervous and stupid men dead. The Torrino brothers had just made the biggest mistake of their criminal careers. They'd given Frank exactly what he needed to destroy them permanently. For the next 2 days, Frank worked with the precision of a Swiss watchmaker. He contacted Maya Lansky in Florida, Lucky Luciano in Italy, and Albert Anastasia in Brooklyn. 3 phone calls that would reshape the power structure of organized crime in New York. "The Torrinos have crossed a line," Frank told each of them. "They've taken civilian personnel. They've threatened torture. They've challenged the basic rules that keep our business civilized." What Frank didn't mention was that he'd been planning to eliminate the Torrino family for months. They'd been too aggressive, too stupid, and too dangerous to the careful balance of power Frank had spent years establishing. The kidnapping wasn't a crisis, it was an opportunity. On November 8th at 3 p.m., Frank pulled up to Warehouse 47 in his black Cadillac. The building was massive, a 5-story brick structure left over from Brooklyn's shipping heyday. Perfect for hiding kidnap victims, perfect for conducting business that required privacy, perfect for what Frank had planned. Frank walked to the main entrance carrying a leather briefcase and wearing his usual 3-piece suit. No bodyguards, no backup, no visible weapons. To anyone watching, he looked like a businessman arriving for a meeting. The warehouse door opened before Frank could knock. Antonio Torrino, the middle brother, gestured him inside with a Lupera shotgun. Frank, punctual as always. The interior of the warehouse was dimly lit by overhead bulbs hanging from the ceiling. Crates and shipping containers created a maze of shadows and blind corners. In the center of the space, the Torrino brothers had set up a makeshift office, a table, some chairs, and Jacob Rosen tied to a wooden post. Jacob looked terrible. 3 days of captivity had left him unshaven, exhausted, and clearly terrified. But he was alive, and apparently unharmed. The Torrinos were smart enough to keep their bargaining chip intact. Salvatore Torrino sat behind the table like a king holding court. Giuseppe stood beside Jacob with a knife in his hand. Antonio positioned himself behind Frank, cutting off any retreat. "So, Frank," Salvatore said, "you ready to be reasonable?" Frank set his briefcase on the table and opened it slowly. Inside were neat stacks of $100 bills, more money than most people saw in a lifetime. $500,000, Frank said. "That's what Jacob is worth to me." Salvatore leaned forward, studying the cash. "That's a lot of money, Frank, but it ain't what we asked for. We want territory, not cash." "I know what you asked for," Frank said calmly. "But I've got a counter-proposal. Take the money, release Jacob, and get out of New York tonight. Permanently." The 3 brothers laughed. Giuseppe pressed his knife against Jacob's throat, just hard enough to draw a thin line of blood. "You ain't in a position to make counter-proposals, Frank." "Actually," Frank said, "I think I am. That's when Frank reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small radio transmitter. The same type of device he'd used in previous operations, but this one had been modified by a very talented electronics specialist. Frank pressed a button on the transmitter outside the warehouse. Car engine started. Footsteps echoed on concrete. The sound of men taking positions around the building. "What the hell is that?" Antonio demanded, swinging his shotgun toward the warehouse doors. "That," Frank said, "is the sound of the Anastasia family, the Gambino family, and the Lucchese family surrounding this warehouse. Approximately 40 men with automatic weapons, all of them very unhappy about what you've done." Salvatore's face went pale. "You're bluffing," Frank shrugged. "Giuseppe, look out that window behind you. Tell your brothers what you see." Giuseppe moved to the grimy warehouse window and peered outside. His face went white as he saw the muzzle flashes and shadows of armed men taking position around the building. Giuseppe's voice cracked. "We got big problems. There's men everywhere." Frank sat down in one of the chairs, making himself comfortable. "Here's the situation. Boys, you kidnapped my accountant, thinking you could force me to give you territory. What you didn't realize is that by taking Jacob, you declared war, not just on me, but on the entire commission." "What commission?" Antonio asked, but his voice suggested he already knew. "The commission that keeps order between the families. The commission that prevents exactly this kind of stupidity from happening. The commission that has very specific rules about kidnapping, torture, and threatening civilian personnel." Frank's voice was conversational, almost friendly. "You broke those rules. Now you're going to pay the price." Frank pressed another button on his transmitter. The warehouse lights went out, plunging the space into darkness. Emergency lighting kicked in a few seconds later, casting eerie shadows throughout the building. "Jesus Christ," Salvatore shouted. "What did you do?" "I cut the main power," Frank said calmly. "The emergency lighting will last about 10 minutes. After that, this place is going to be pitch black. And in the dark, my associates outside are going to enter this building and eliminate anyone who is unarmed Frank Costello or Jacob Rosen." The Torrino brothers were starting to panic. They'd gone from holding all the cards to being trapped like rats in their own warehouse. Wait, Salvatore said desperately. "Let's talk about this. Let's make a deal." "We are making a deal," Frank replied. "The deal is simple. You release Jacob immediately. You leave New York tonight, and you never come back. In exchange, I let you live. And if we don't," Frank looked at his watch, "then in about 8 minutes, when those lights go out, you're all going to die in the dark." Giuseppe was still holding his knife to Jacob's throat, but his hand was shaking. "Sal, maybe we should take the deal." "Shut up," Salvatore snapped. "Frank's bluffing. He needs us alive to get his accountant back." "Actually," Frank said, "I don't need you alive at all. Jacob is valuable to me, yes, but not valuable enough to let you threaten me and get away with it." Frank stood up and walked closer to the table. "You want to know the truth? I've been planning to eliminate your family for months. You've been too sloppy, too aggressive, too dangerous to the peace we've established. The kidnapping just gave me the excuse I needed to do it with the commission's blessing. You son of a bitch." Antonio raised his shotgun, pointing it directly at Frank's chest. "Antonio," Frank said quietly, "before you pull that trigger, you might want to know something. That briefcase full of money, it's not just money." "What are you talking about?" Frank smiled. "It's also a radio beacon. Every man outside this building knows exactly where I am at all times. If my signal stops moving, if my heart stops beating, they have orders to burn this warehouse to the ground with everyone inside." The emergency lights flickered, warning that they were about to fail. "Time's running out. Boys," Frank said. "What's it going to be?" That's when Jacob Rosen did something that surprised everyone. Instead of staying quiet and helpless, he spoke for the first time since Frank had arrived. "Frank," Jacob said clearly, "the knife isn't real." Everyone turned to stare at him. Giuseppe looked down at the blade in his hand, confusion spreading across his face. "It's a theater prop," Jacob continued. "Collapsible blade. They've been threatening me with a fake knife for 3 days because they were afraid real blood would make their demands less credible." Frank began to laugh. Not loud, not mocking, just genuine amusement. "Fake knife, fake tough guys, fake threats. Is there anything real about you Torrino brothers except your stupidity?" The emergency lights went out, plunging the warehouse into complete darkness. What happened next lasted exactly 4 minutes and 17 seconds. Frank had memorized the layout of the warehouse during his brief time inside. He moved through the darkness with the confidence of a man who'd planned every step. The Torrino brothers, panicked and disoriented, made the fatal mistake of firing their weapons in the dark. Muzzle flashes lit up the warehouse like lightning, revealing their positions to the men who'd been waiting outside. When the main power was restored and the lights came back on, the Torrino brothers were on the ground, unconscious but alive. Frank's associates had used non-lethal methods: blackjacks, chloroform, precisely applied pressure to nerve points. Professional work. Frank cut Jacob free from the post and helped him to his feet. "You okay, Jacob?" "I am now," Jacob said, rubbing his wrists where the ropes had been. "Though I have to ask, how did you know the knife was fake?" "I didn't," Frank admitted. "But I knew the Torrino brothers. They're not smart enough to plan a real torture session. Too squeamish for actual violence despite all their tough talk. Meyer Lansky emerged from the shadows, flanked by 4 armed men. "Frank, what do you want us to do with these 3 idiots?" Frank looked down at the unconscious Torrino brothers. "Load them onto a boat. Drop them off in Sicily with one-way tickets and a clear message. Never come back to America. If they're ever seen in New York again, they disappear permanently, and the warehouse, burn it down. Make sure there's no evidence of what happened here tonight." By midnight, the Torrino family's operation in Brooklyn had been completely dismantled. Their warehouses were empty, their men had scattered, and their leaders were on a cargo ship bound for Italy. Frank had eliminated a major threat to his organization without killing anyone, without causing a war, and without attracting federal attention. Jacob Rosen returned to work the next day as if nothing had happened. The kidnapping was never reported to police, never made the newspapers, and never became public knowledge. In the secretive world where Frank operated, problems were solved quietly and permanently. But the real lesson of November 8, 1952, wasn't about kidnapping or ransom or territorial disputes. It was about the difference between real power and the illusion of power. The Torrino brothers had thought they could intimidate Frank Costello with threats and fake weapons. They'd learned too late that Frank's power came not from what he threatened to do, but from what he was actually capable of doing. 3 weeks later, Frank received a postcard from Sicily. No message, no signature, just a picture of a small fishing village. Frank studied the postcard for a moment, then dropped it in his fireplace and watched it burn. The commission met the following month to discuss the Torrino incident. Frank's handling of the situation was praised as a textbook example of how to eliminate threats without destabilizing the larger organization. No bloodshed, no police investigation, no federal attention. That's the difference between a boss and a leader. Lucky Luciano would later write from his exile in Italy. A boss would have killed the Torrino brothers and started a war. Frank turned their stupidity into an opportunity to strengthen his position with the other families. Frank Costello had walked into that Brooklyn warehouse facing what appeared to be an impossible situation. Rescue his accountant while avoiding a war that could destroy his empire. He'd walked out having eliminated his enemies, strengthened his alliances, and proven once again that intelligence was more powerful than violence. The briefcase full of money was never recovered. Some say Frank distributed it to the families who'd supported him that night. Others say he donated it to Father O'Brien's old parish, but people who knew Frank best understood that the money had never been about the ransom. It had been about showing the Torrino brothers exactly how much their lives were worth to him. $500,000. Not enough to buy his territory, but exactly enough to pay for their exile. That's the kind of arithmetic Frank Costello understood better than anyone in New York. The precise calculation of power, respect, and fear that kept the city's underworld functioning according to his rules.